Good morning, I'm Graham Bocock. I'm the Managing Director of Oakwood Valuation Surveyors in Cheshire. We advise farmers and landowners on a range of property and business related matters. Today I'm going to talk to you about farm succession planning. This is something that's been around probably since the Enclosure Act, when farming started becoming an industry. Too many farm businesses we see don't plan early enough or don't plan at all. Why is that? Well, I've identified three key barriers. I know there are many more, but I suspect they're all interconnected. The first barrier is the emotion. Farming is a very emotional business. It's life and death, literally at times, particularly on livestock farms. Farmers are beholden to the climate, to the weather, to other people, and it's a very emotional business. Allied to that, number two, family. There are very few sectors of business where family plays such an important part in the ownership and operation, and that can be very difficult. Whilst there are many strengths to having family involved, there can be weaknesses. The dispute in the parlour at 5 o'clock on a Thursday morning doesn't have to come home to roost at Granny's birthday party on Sunday afternoon. The third element, again tied up with the family, is housing, because it's a sector where housing is very often provided as part of the operation, the traditional farmhouse, the farm bungalow, the farm cottages. And that can be very difficult, again with the emotions of moving around to accommodate the business. Within these there's a range of issues. On the family, for example, there can be over-promotion or under-promotion. Is the best person for the job actually doing it, or is somebody from the family doing it because they're available and willing to do it, and perhaps with an eye to the future of taking over the business? So where do we start when we're asked onto a farm to look at the succession planning? We actually begin at the end with an exit strategy, and this is good practice for all businesses. Your exit strategy has to cover a range of issues. It has to allow for death, particularly death out of order. So the 25-year-old who sadly dies in a car accident or from illness, you have to accommodate that somewhere in your succession planning, not just death when people are of an age where it's to be more expected. Retirement, again, there's an expectation that retirement occurs at a certain age, 60, 65, 70, whatever it is, doesn't really matter. But what if somebody wants to retire early? What if they suffer from ill health and need to take a backseat from the business when they're 40 years old? So retirement has to be considered. Then there's the more complex issues of disputes. What happens when a partnership, a farming business breaks down and you have to split it up? How is that accommodated for in what the parties want? And again, within that, we talk about what we call bad leavers. For example, somebody who's incurred a large debt on behalf of the farming business without the business's consent and then is asked to leave is considered legally to be what's called a bad leaver, and you have to accommodate that within your documentation. Now we'll be looking at the business operation versus the property ownership, and it's quite possible to split them. A lot of businesses don't. A lot of businesses don't consider it or don't think it's possible, but you have to be thinking, well, do you want the business to continue? In the event of all these things, death, retirement, dispute, how will the business continue? Can it continue? What are the operations that need to be put in place to ensure business continuity? We would also look at the structure that you employ. Traditionally, farming family businesses operate as a partnership. Nothing wrong with that. It's a very straightforward way to operate, but increasingly we see the use of limited companies. And of course these have the benefit of being able to offer shares which are perhaps more easily transferred than a partnership share, and there may be taxation benefits to using a limited company. Now which route you go down is really a matter for your accountant and something that the parties are comfortable with, but there are pros and cons for both running as a partnership or a limited company. Once you've made that agreement, there should be documentation, either a partnership agreement or a shareholder agreement. All the things I've talked about, the death, the retirement, the dispute, the bad leaving, all of that has to be accommodated in your documentation. Otherwise it becomes slightly pointless almost having the documentation if you don't cover all these things off. We would recommend, and I'm sure your lawyers would all recommend, that you have a will, and the will should tie into that partnership agreement or shareholder agreement. It shouldn't be different, because when somebody passes away, you must be able to define what's going to happen to the business. So the will should be consistent with other documents. I would also recommend tenancies. If, for example, mother and father own a block of land that they bought a few years ago, and that is used by the farming business, my advice is for it to be held on a proper formal written tenancy agreement. Not just so that we know who cuts the hedges and who puts the fertiliser on and what the rent's to be and when it's paid, but it also helps in the event of death, because there is agricultural property relief, as in no tax payable on death for property held and occupied under a farm business tenancy agreement, subject to certain criteria, as with all of these things. So having the proper documentation, it just saves the argument with the HMRC, irrespective of any sort of disputes or debates within the family. A power of attorney is something which most lawyers would also recommend. That enables somebody who becomes ill or incapacitated in some way to be represented within the business. So again, business continuity, somebody to make decisions there so that the business can continue. All of these things you'll see come back to the beginning of what do the parties want to achieve, and having decided that, to get proper documentation. Now just a couple of little points before I sign off. If you operate as a sole trader and you pass away, your bank account is frozen at the date you die. You cannot then pay bills, and we've seen this with some fairly sizable businesses where the only person who could sign the cheques died, and that creates a real problem for those left behind. Again, thinking about it early, partnership or limited company structure, but make sure that there are alternative signatories on the bank account. There is also plans now for a retirement scheme for farmers. Now, whether there's enough money to enable farmers to retire remains to be seen. The detail is still being worked out. But of course, that may encourage farmers to obviously leave the industry, and it's something that needs to be worked out. But we've got to consider what's left behind in terms of, again, business continuity. And everything I've been looking at really is about managing the business continuity and making sure that as a farming business and a farming family, you have everything in place for the future success. Thank you.